My name is Evelyn. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, easygoing, and low maintenance. I work in marketing strategy, but that's rarely what people remember about me. What they remember is that I listen more than I speak, that I don't interrupt. I smile politely when conversations drift past me rather than toward me. People often mistake that for passivity. If you had met me a year ago at a dinner party, you might have thought I was the quiet wife who lets her husband take the lead. The one who refills glasses, remembers birthdays, and smooths over awkward moments with a soft laugh. I was underestimated not because I lacked intelligence or confidence, but because I never felt the need to announce either. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There are no secret affairs, no shouting matches, no slammed doors. It's about something quieter, and in many ways more common. It's about how small jokes, when repeated often enough, stop being jokes. How embarrassment, when publicly dressed as humor, can slowly teach lessons that pride never could. The night this story centers on was an ordinary dinner with friends. Good food, familiar faces, easy conversation. My husband was relaxed, joking, and enjoying the attention, and at some point, almost casually, he began to make me the subject of those jokes. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough that everyone laughed and no one questioned it, including me. What follows isn't a tale of revenge. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't storm out, I didn't confront him at the table or humiliate him in return. I simply allowed something to finish, naturally, publicly, and without interference. This is a story about restraint, about choosing silence not as surrender, but as clarity, about how letting someone continue unchecked can sometimes reveal more than stopping them ever could. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through how I was seen, how I learned to see myself more accurately, and how one evening shifted the balance of an entire relationship without a single dramatic scene. There are no heroes or villains here, only adults facing the consequences of patterns they thought were harmless. I'm telling this story not to assign blame, but to document a transformation, one that unfolded slowly, deliberately, and without spectacle. Because sometimes the most powerful moments don't announce themselves, they simply arrive, and everything after has to adjust. So before we begin, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever been in a room where people were laughing and slowly realized the joke was you? To most people in our circle, I was the reasonable one. That was the word that followed me from room to room. Reasonable Evelyn. Calm Evelyn. The one you could sit next to at dinner and never feel challenged by. The one who remembered everyone's allergies. Who brought a hostess gift without making it a performance. Who noticed when someone's voice dropped and quietly shifted the subject. I was useful in that way. Comfortable, non-threatening. When my husband Daniel introduced me to new people, he often did it with a smile and a light tone. "This is Evelyn," he'd say. "She keeps me organized. I'd forget my own head without her." People laughed. I smiled. It sounded affectionate enough to pass. I told myself that partnerships were built on contrast, that his loud confidence and my quiet steadiness balanced each other out. At gatherings, Daniel took up space effortlessly. He told stories, he reenacted moments. He had a talent for timing a punchline just right. People leaned toward him when he spoke. I sat slightly back, angled just enough to be included, but not centered. No one ignored me outright. That's important. I wasn't invisible in a dramatic sense. People asked how work was going. They complimented my dress. They thanked me when I passed the bread. But there was an unspoken understanding in the room that I wasn't the main voice. I was part of the background harmony, not the melody. And for a long time, I accepted that role without resentment. I told myself it was maturity, that not needing attention was a sign of confidence, that real power didn't need to be loud. There's some truth in that. But there's also a difference between choosing quiet and being quietly chosen for. Looking back, I can see how consistently that choice was made on my behalf. When plans were discussed, Daniel answered for both of us. When Evelyn and I went to Spain, when we decided it was best to, I rarely corrected the language. It felt petty, and besides, the outcomes were usually fine. Not perfect, but fine enough to justify my silence. Friends assumed I agreed with him, that I preferred it this way. Even I assumed that for a while. At dinners, I was often seated next to someone who needed a listener. The friend is going through a breakup, the coworker is frustrated with their boss, the cousin is unsure about a move. I absorbed their words, offered careful responses, and asked questions that helped them think. No one ever said, "Evelyn gives the best advice," out loud, but they kept finding their way back to my side. Quiet validation, tucked between courses. Daniel noticed this, I think, but not as something to respect, more as something convenient. I handled emotional labor the way he handled conversation momentum. We each had our lane, except that his lane was visible. Mine was assumed. If someone had asked me then whether I felt diminished, I would have said no. Honestly, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, anchored, necessary in ways that didn't need applause. What I didn't realize was that necessity without acknowledgement slowly reshapes how others speak about you, and eventually how they speak to you. Jokes began to land more often in my direction, but lightly. Comments about how I was too practical, too serious, the brakes on the fun, always said with a grin, always followed by laughter that wasn't cruel, just unexamined. I laughed too. That's the part people rarely understand. I wasn't hurt in a way that demanded defense. I was adjusted to, positioned. I was the safe target, the one who wouldn't react, the one who would smooth things over if the joke went slightly too far. And once a role is established like that, it becomes very easy for everyone to forget that it was never formally agreed to. I wasn't seen as someone who would leave a table, or draw a boundary publicly, or allow silence to become uncomfortable. I was seen as someone who would always stay, always soften, always absorb. That perception didn't come from nowhere. I helped build it. And that's what made what happened later so instructive. Not just for Daniel, but for everyone watching. Because when someone who has always made things easy stops intervening, the room learns something new. The first time I noticed it, truly noticed it, wasn't because it hurt. It was because it lingered. We were at a casual dinner with friends, nothing formal, just a long wooden table, shared plates, and the comfortable noise of people who'd known each other long enough to stop performing. Someone asked how Daniel and I managed our schedules, both of us working demanding jobs. Before I could answer, Daniel smiled and said, "Well, Evelyn handles the boring stuff. I just show up where I'm told." It landed as a joke. Everyone laughed, even me. On the surface, it sounded harmless, self-deprecating even. He was positioning himself as the disorganized one, the dreamer. I am the competent anchor, a compliment if you tilted your head the right way. But something about it stayed with me long after the plates were cleared. The boring stuff, not important, not complex, not the things that keep our life running, just boring. Later that night, as I brushed my teeth, I replayed the moment in my head. Not obsessively, just once or twice. I tried to locate the discomfort. It wasn't anger, it wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. I realized I had laughed automatically. Not because it was funny, but because that's what the room expected. Laughter smoothed the moment, signaled that everything was fine, that no correction was needed. And so none was offered. A week later, there was another comment. This time, about how I always double-check restaurant reservations because I don't trust vibes. The table chuckled. Someone said, "We all need an Evelyn." Again, not cruel, but again, reductive. I was becoming a function, not a person. Still, I said nothing. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. That long marriages develop shorthand. That humor evolves. That intent mattered more than impact. And maybe it did, but patterns matter too. The third time was the one that finally made me pause internally. A friend asked if we'd ever consider moving to a different city. Daniel answered easily. Evelyn wouldn't survive without her routines. There it was. Wouldn't enjoy. I would prefer stability. Wouldn't survive. The laughter that followed was louder this time. I felt it land differently in my body. Not sharp, but cold. Like something sliding into place. I smiled. I took a sip of water. I didn't contradict him. No one looked at me to check if I agreed. That part mattered more than the joke itself. Because in that moment, it became clear that the room had already decided who I was. The joke worked because it aligned with the version of me they'd been given repeatedly. I went home that night and didn't bring it up. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready. I needed to understand whether this was a misunderstanding or a mirror. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention. Quietly. Not in a suspicious way, in a documentary way. As if I were observing a dynamic I'd somehow been cast in without an audition. Daniel didn't mean to diminish me. I believe that. But meaning isn't the same as effect, and the effect accumulates. Each small cut was shallow enough to dismiss on its own. Together they formed a shape, a silhouette of someone overly rigid, overly cautious, faintly joyless. Someone easy to joke about. What struck me most was how comfortable everyone seemed with it, including me. That realization was sobering. I understood then that if I ever wanted this dynamic to change, it wouldn't start with a confrontation. It would start with me no longer cushioning the impact. Because as long as I laughed, the joke would keep finding me. And so I began to do something very subtle. I stopped pre-laughing. I still smiled. I stayed present. But I let jokes finish without rescuing them, without signaling approval. No one noticed at first. Why would they? The rhythm of the room didn't change yet. But I noticed. And once you notice the first small cut, you start to recognize how many times you've been quietly bleeding without ever calling it a wound. Once I began noticing the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. What surprised me wasn't how often the comments happened, it was how easily they slid into normal conversation, unchallenged, unquestioned, almost invisible. They didn't arrive as insults. They arrived as context, as if the room needed a shorthand version of me to keep the story moving, and I had helped supply it. Daniel's jokes followed a familiar arc. I was the practical one, the cautious one, the one who needed convincing, the one who kept spreadsheets where others followed instinct. None of these things was false. That was the trick. They were distortions built from truth, exaggerated just enough to entertain. That's how normalization works. It doesn't invent, it selects. At first, I rationalized my silence. I told myself that correcting him would make things awkward, that no one meant harm, that marriage required flexibility, not scorekeeping. I reminded myself of all the ways Daniel supported me privately, how he trusted my judgment when it mattered, how he came to me for advice when no one else was around. Surely that counted for something. But public space teaches different lessons than private reassurance. In public, repetition becomes identity. I noticed how friends began to speak to me through the lens Daniel provided. "You probably hate surprises," someone said once, casually. "You're not really a risk taker, right?" another assumed. They weren't asking. They were confirming. I corrected them gently when it felt necessary, but usually I let it pass. Correcting every assumption would have turned me into exactly what the jokes implied. Overly serious, overly exacting. So I chose the path of least resistance. Again, there was a part of me that believed endurance was virtuous, that being unbothered was a kind of strength. If I didn't react, the comments would eventually lose interest and fade. But instead, they settled in. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It tests the environment first. It watches what gets tolerated, then expands to fill that space. The more I absorbed without reaction, the more room there was for interpretation. And interpretation is rarely generous. I began to hear a new tone underneath the jokes. Not from Daniel, but from others. A slight impatience when I offered a counterpoint. A quick override when I tried to add context. It wasn't hostility, it was dismissed. And the most unsettling part was how natural it felt. I caught myself editing my own words before speaking, shortening explanations, softening opinions, preemptively minimizing myself to stay aligned with the role I was expected to play. Reliable, helpful, slightly dull? I told myself it was diplomacy. Those relationships require adaptation, but adaptation without reciprocity becomes erasure. There were moments, small, private moments, when I felt a flicker of resentment. I extinguished it quickly. Resentment felt too dramatic for what was happening, too emotional. I didn't want to become the kind of person who couldn't take a joke. That phrase, "can't take a joke," is a powerful silencer. It frames dignity as fragility and deflection as humor. So I took the jokes. I took them with grace, with humor, with patience. Until one day, I realized something unsettling. I no longer knew how I was being seen without them. If the jokes stopped, would there be silence? Would anyone know how to describe me without reducing me? That question lingered. It became clear that the issue wasn't any single comment. It was the cumulative permission. The way my quiet acceptance had taught everyone, including my husband, that this version of me was accurate enough to repeat. I wasn't angry at Daniel, not yet. I was more curious than anything. Curious about how far a pattern could go if left uninterrupted. Curious about what would happen if I stopped managing everyone's comfort. Because I was tired, not of the jokes themselves, but of the maintenance required to make them harmless. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to loosen my grip on that responsibility. I stopped filling pauses, stopped softening edges, stopped translating myself into something more palatable. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't dramatize it. I simply withdrew my consent to be shaped by repetition. At the time, no one outs. But normalization works both ways. And once silence becomes intentional, it starts to speak louder than laughter ever did. Roles are rarely discussed out loud. They're implied, reinforced, and eventually defended, often by the very people who benefit from them. By the time I became aware of mine, it had already solidified. I was the stabilizer, the one who remembered logistics, the one who followed through, the one who would quietly adjust if plans changed or expectations shifted. In group settings, I was the safety net, the person others leaned on without asking whether I wanted the weight. It wasn't an unkind role, but it was limiting. Daniel leaned into it more than he realized. When something went wrong socially, a forgotten reservation, a miscommunication, he'd glance at me reflexively as if waiting for me to fix it, not because he doubted himself, but because I had always stepped in before. And so the room learned, if someone needed clarification, they looked to me. If someone felt uneasy, they sat next to me. If something needed smoothing over, I handled it. What I didn't handle was how rarely anyone checked whether I was comfortable being the emotional infrastructure. The jokes reinforced the role. The comments kept it light, digestible, They made it seem like I enjoyed being the responsible one, that I derived my identity from it. In reality, I derived my identity from competence, from care, from doing things well. But competence, when repeatedly framed as rigidity, becomes something else entirely. I began to notice how the role protected others from accountability. If Daniel forgot something, it was charming. If I remembered, it was expected. If he spoke impulsively, it was spontaneous. If I paused to consider, it was cautious. The contrast made him more interesting. It made me predictable. And predictability is often mistaken for simplicity. What struck me most was how little resistance there was when the role expanded. I was expected to be understanding, to be flexible, to absorb inconvenience with grace. When I did push back, rarely, gently, it was met with surprise. Not anger, just confusion, as if I'd broken character. "You're usually fine with this," someone would say. That sentence carries a lot of weight. It doesn't ask how you feel. It reminds you of who you're supposed to be. I realized then that the role wasn't just how others saw me, it was how they related to me. It determined what they felt entitled to. My time, my patience, my adaptability. And the more consistently I fulfilled it, the more it defined me. There's a strange loneliness in being seen only for what you provide, especially when what you provide is emotional stability. It leaves little room for messiness or evolution. I wasn't allowed to change without explanation. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I began to see that the role existed because it worked. For everyone else. It kept dinners pleasant, conversations smooth, relationships frictionless. It allowed others to remain unexamined while I absorbed the adjustments. And I had agreed to it, over and over again, through silence. But agreement can be withdrawn. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't declare a boundary. I simply stopped anticipating needs that weren't voiced, stopped correcting misunderstandings that didn't involve me, stopped cushioning Daniel's words when they landed poorly. I stayed present. I stayed calm. But I let outcomes unfold without intervention. The shift was subtle, but the room felt it. Not consciously yet. I was still polite, still kind, still engaged, but I was no longer the invisible glue holding everything together. And without that glue, people began to feel small fractures they couldn't quite explain. They didn't know it yet, but the role they had assigned me was about to be tested, not with confrontation, but with absence. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic realization sparked by a single cruel moment. It happened quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, in a space so familiar it barely registered as significant at the time. I was sitting at our kitchen table, my laptop open but untouched, a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. Outside, the day moved on without ceremony. Cars passed. A neighbor's dog barked once, then settled. Daniel was talking. He was telling me a story about work, an exchange with a colleague that he found amusing. I listened, nodding where it made sense, offering small acknowledgments. Halfway through, he paused, smiled, and said something lightly dismissive about how I wouldn't get it anyway because I wasn't in his field. It wasn't said unkindly. It wasn't even new. But this time I felt something settle instead of slide past. I realized I wasn't hurt. I was done translating. In the past, I would have smoothed it over internally, told myself he didn't mean it that way, that it was shorthand, that I understood him better than he understood himself sometimes. That afternoon, I simply let the comment exist. I didn't respond right away. I didn't fill the space. I didn't reassure him with a smile or a joke. I looked at him, calmly, attentively, and waited. The silence stretched longer than either of us expected. He shifted slightly, then continued talking, adjusting his tone. He filled the gap for both of us. And in that moment, I felt the internal change take hold. I understood that I had been doing more emotional labor than I realized, not just for the relationship, but for his self-image. I had been constantly smoothing the edges of his words, shaping them into something more considerate than they were. Removing that buffer didn't require confrontation, it required restraint. That was the day I stopped explaining myself internally. I stopped justifying why things didn't bother me, stopped reframing comments into something acceptable, stopped making meaning for others at my own expense. Instead, I began to observe how often I was expected to absorb without acknowledgement. And once you stop absorbing, you notice how heavy things actually are. Later that week, we had dinner with friends. The same dynamic played out. Daniel made a comment about my need to plan everything. The table laughed. This time, I didn't laugh immediately. I let the moment breathe. Not as a statement, as a fact. The laughter faded more quickly than usual. Someone cleared their throat. Conversation moved on, slightly off rhythm. No one confronted him. No one defended me. And that was fine. What mattered was that I hadn't stepped in to rescue the moment. On the drive home, Daniel asked if I was tired. I said yes, which was true. I didn't explain further. I didn't bring up the joke. I didn't request an apology. I was learning something important. Clarity doesn't require disclosure. The shift was internal, but its effects were already external. I began to see that my silence had previously been interpreted as agreement. Now, without the usual emotional cues, it became ambiguous, and ambiguity makes people uneasy. That unease wasn't my responsibility to resolve. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't testing anyone. I was simply allowing interactions to reflect themselves without my constant intervention. That day at the kitchen table marked the end of something I hadn't known I'd been carrying. I didn't feel lighter immediately. Change like that is subtle, but I felt steadier, more aligned with myself. And once alignment happens, there's no unseeing the imbalance that came before. I didn't know then where this shift would lead. I only knew that I would no longer rush to make myself smaller so that others could feel more comfortable. The rest would reveal itself in time. Once the shift happened, silence felt different. Before, my quietness had been automatic, reflexive, a way of keeping things smooth. Now it was deliberate, chosen. And because it was chosen, it carried weight. I still spoke when I had something to say. That part didn't change. What changed was what I no longer rushed to say. I stopped preemptively agreeing, stopped translating jokes into reassurance, stopped filling pauses that weren't mine to fill. And almost immediately, people began to misread it. They thought I was tired, distracted, maybe a little withdrawn. No one asked directly. That's the thing about expectations. They rarely invite clarification. They assume continuity. At dinners, Daniel continued as usual. He told stories. He joked. Occasionally, he used me as a reference point, the way he always had. The difference was that I no longer corrected the framing. When he joked about my obsession with details, I didn't counter with humor. I let the comment stand on its own. When someone laughed a little too long, I didn't smile to signal approval. I stayed neutral, present, calm. Silence, when it's not anxious, unsettles people. The room began to hesitate where it hadn't before. Laughter tapered off more quickly. People glanced at me, not to include me, but to check something they couldn't name. I wasn't cold, I wasn't angry. I was unavailable for self-erasure. Daniel noticed the shift before anyone else, not consciously at first. He'd pause after certain jokes, waiting for my usual response. When it didn't come, he'd adjust mid-sentence or redirect attention elsewhere. We never discussed it. That was important. By not naming the change, I allowed it to become a new baseline rather than a negotiation. It wasn't a demand, it was a presence. And presence doesn't argue. I realized then how much emotional labor I'd been performing simply by reacting. My laughter had been a signal. My reassurance had been a cushion. Removing those elements forced others to sit with the rawness of their words. Some of those words held up fine, others didn't. That wasn't my responsibility. People often believe silence is passive, but strategic silence is an active restraint. It's the decision not to manage outcomes that don't belong to you. I began to feel something unexpected, clarity. Without my constant smoothing, interactions revealed their true shape. I could see who spoke thoughtfully and who relied on easy humor, who adjusted when the room shifted, and who doubled down. Daniel, to his credit, tried, awkwardly at first. He softened some jokes, he redirected stories, but habits formed over the years don't dissolve overnight. And I wasn't there to coach him through it. I didn't want apologies prompted by discomfort. I wanted awareness that emerged naturally. Silence gave him space to hear himself. Friends began to interact with me differently too. Some leaned in, asking more direct questions. Others kept their distance, unsure of the new boundaries. Both responses told me something useful. I was no longer everyone's emotional stabilizer, and in losing that role, I gained something else. Self-respect that didn't need to be announced. There was power in that. Not dominance, not control, but autonomy. I wasn't manipulating the room. I was simply no longer compensating for it. The most revealing part was how quickly people assumed my silence meant weakness. That assumption allowed them to continue as before, briefly. They didn't realize that by stepping back, I was finally seeing clearly. And what I saw would soon make further silence not just a choice, but a strategy. What no one noticed, because they were too focused on my quiet, was how much information silence gives you. When you stop performing, you start observing. I began to see patterns with a clarity I hadn't had before. Not because anything new was happening, but because I was no longer distracted by the task of managing how things felt. I wasn't scanning faces to adjust tone. I wasn't anticipating needs. I wasn't cushioning outcomes. I was simply present. And presence, without obligation, is remarkably sharp. I noticed how Daniel's jokes followed a predictable rhythm. They appeared most often when he felt socially confident, when the room was warm, when attention flowed easily toward him. The jokes weren't defensive. They were performative, a way to maintain momentum. That mattered, because it told me this wasn't about malice. It was about habit and reward. The room rewarded him with laughter. I had rewarded him with acceptance. Remove one reward, and behavior wavers. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked me direct questions in group settings, unless they needed something. Advice, validation, clarification, emotional labor disguised as curiosity. When I didn't immediately provide it, some people became slightly uncomfortable. Others became distant. That discomfort was instructive. It showed me who valued my presence and who valued my function. At home, Daniel filled the silences I left behind. He talked more, explained himself more, occasionally checked in with, "You okay?" in a tone that suggested uncertainty rather than concern. I always answered honestly, "Yes, I'm fine," because I was. I wasn't suppressing anything. I wasn't building resentment. I was gathering data. And the data was consistent. Daniel underestimated how much I had been doing behind the scenes, not just practically, but relationally. He didn't see the way I redirected conversations away from him when he crossed a line, or how often I reframed his words before others could interpret them uncharitably. He thought the room worked on its own. It didn't. I had been editing reality. Friends began to make small comments in my absence. I'd hear about them later, indirectly. "Daniel seemed a bit off last night. You were quiet? Everything okay?" They noticed the effect, but not the cause. No one considered that I might simply be done compensating. I started documenting things. Not formally, not obsessively. Just mentally at first, then occasionally in notes on my phone. Not quotes, but patterns. Timing, context. This wasn't preparation for confrontation, it was preparation for the truth. There's a difference. I also took a closer look at our shared life. Financially, logistically, structurally. Not because I planned to leave, but because clarity demands a full picture. I realized how much I'd deferred. How often were they framed as mutual when the momentum was one-sided? How often my flexibility had been mistaken for agreement. None of this felt dramatic. It felt sobering and, strangely, peaceful. Because once you stop trying to be understood, you can finally understand. Daniel continued to assume my silence was temporary. A phase, a mood, something that would pass once I rested or relaxed. That assumption gave me time to observe how he behaved without my softening influence. Time to see how others responded when I wasn't managing impressions. What I saw wasn't catastrophic, but it was conclusive. People didn't adjust because they didn't realize adjustment was required. The system had worked too well for too long, and systems don't change unless something essential is removed. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I didn't dramatize it. I simply became unavailable for roles I had never agreed to play. And while no one noticed immediately, the structure began to strain under its own weight. Because what they never noticed was that the quiet woman at the table had always been the one holding the shape of the room. And without that shape, things start to reveal their true form. The reveal wasn't something I stumbled upon suddenly. It unfolded slowly, the way clarity often does, layer by layer, without spectacle. There was no moment of triumph, no surge of adrenaline, just a quiet understanding settling into place, undeniable and calm. I realized that what I had wasn't power over anyone. It was leverage over my own participation. And that changed everything. In the past, I had assumed that if something bothered me, the responsible thing to do was address it. Communicate, explain, fix. That belief kept me invested in dynamics that didn't require my explanation. They required my withdrawal. The private reveal was this. I was no longer obligated to translate myself into a version that made others comfortable. Once I accepted that, other truths followed naturally. I saw clearly how interdependent our social and domestic life actually was. Daniel's confidence in public spaces relied heavily on my emotional steadiness. Our shared routines depended on my planning more than I had acknowledged. The boring details weren't peripheral, they were structural. I had been treating structure as neutral. It wasn't. Structure confers power quietly, and I had been managing most of it. This realization didn't make me feel superior. It made me precise. I began reviewing things I'd long taken for granted. Bank accounts, long-term plans, shared obligations. Not with suspicion, but with intent. Knowing where you stand isn't a threat to trust, it's a prerequisite for autonomy. I noticed how often I'd deferred decisions simply because it was easier. How often I'd allowed Daniel's preferences to set the direction because I didn't feel strongly enough to oppose them. That wasn't a compromise, it was a drift. And drift, over time, always favors the louder current. The most important part of the reveal wasn't external. It was internal. I understood that I no longer needed to prove anything. Not my intelligence, not my worth, not my resilience. If a room couldn't see me without reduction, that wasn't a failure on my part. It was information. I also realized something more difficult to admit. Daniel didn't fully know me anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because I had slowly made myself predictable to keep things easy. Predictability had protected us from conflict, but it had also flattened me. The private reveal wasn't that I needed to leave or confront him immediately. It was that I needed to stop managing his perception of me. That distinction mattered. I didn't want an apology born of guilt. I wanted awareness born of absence. So I made a decision to continue as I was, not silent, but selective. Not distant, but unperformative. I didn't correct jokes, I didn't reframe narratives, I didn't fill in gaps that weren't mine. And as I stepped back, the imbalance became clearer, not just to me, but eventually to others. Leverage doesn't require aggression, it requires clarity and timing. I had both. The reveal also showed me something else. I was prepared, emotionally and practically, for outcomes I had once avoided imagining. Not because I expected the worst, but because I was no longer afraid of knowing where things stood. There's a particular calm that comes from that kind of readiness. It doesn't rush, it doesn't threaten, it waits. And waiting when it's grounded is not passive. It's decisive. I didn't tell anyone about this internal shift. I didn't journal it dramatically or frame it as a turning point. But from that moment on, every choice I made was informed by it. And once you see your leverage clearly, you don't rush to use it. You let the moment come to you. The decision point didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a calm intersection, quiet, unmarked, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. By then, I had already stopped reacting, stopped compensating, stopped editing. Life had settled into a new rhythm that felt steadier, even if slightly unfamiliar. Daniel sensed the change, but without a clear cause to address, he treated it like background noise. Until the dinner. It was a small gathering, friends we'd known for years. Familiar enough that no one felt the need to be careful. Comfortable enough that habits surfaced easily. We sat around a long table, wine poured, conversation flowing. Daniel was in a good mood, confident, relaxed. The room rewarded him with attention. And then, as if on cue, he began. He joked about how I overthink everything, about how I turn simple decisions into spreadsheets, about how I was the reason spontaneous plans rarely stuck. The laughter came quickly. I felt the moment crystallize. Not emotionally, but strategically. This was the intersection. In the past, I would have intervened. A smile, a counter joke, a gentle clarification that softened the framing, something to balance the narrative and keep the room comfortable. This time, I saw all of the options clearly. I could laugh and let the pattern continue. I could correct him and become the problem. I could confront him later and keep the public version intact. Or I could do nothing. Nothing in this case was an avoidance. It was a selection. I chose to let him finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't smile. I didn't rescue the joke or redirect the conversation. I simply sat there, attentive, composed, and silent. The laughter lingered, then thinned. Without my usual participation, the joke lost its anchor. It hung in the air longer than expected. Someone shifted in their seat. Another reached for their glass. Daniel noticed, too late. He added another comment, trying to regain momentum. It landed unevenly. For the first time, the room felt the imbalance I had been absorbing for years. And I did nothing to fix it. That was the decision point. Because once you allow a dynamic to reveal itself publicly, you can't undo what others have seen. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt steady. The conversation moved on, but something had changed. People spoke more cautiously. A few glanced at me, not for reassurance, but with curiosity. On the drive home, Daniel was quieter than usual. Later that night, he asked if something was wrong. I told him the truth, carefully. I'm just not going to manage moments like that anymore. I didn't accuse. I didn't list grievances. I didn't explain in detail. I stated a boundary without dramatizing it. He nodded, unsure what to do with that information. That uncertainty was necessary, because this wasn't a request for change. It was a declaration of self. From that moment on, the path forward narrowed. Either the dynamic would adjust on its own, or it wouldn't. And I was prepared for either outcome. The irreversible choice wasn't silence. It was refusing to pretend that silence meant consent. Once that line is crossed, there's no going back to the old version of things. The room had seen something. So had he. And now the consequences would begin, not as punishment, but as a natural response. After that dinner, nothing appeared to change. That was the part most people misunderstand about decisive moments. They expect visible aftermath, arguments, apologies, sudden shifts in behavior. But real change, the kind that lasts, often begins invisibly. I didn't bring the dinner up again. Daniel didn't either. On the surface, life continued as usual. We went to work. We shared meals. We talked about logistics, plans, and the small mechanics of living together. Anyone looking in from the outside would have seen continuity. But internally, something had already moved into motion. Moving in silence doesn't mean secrecy. It means intention without announcement. I began to separate things that had long been blurred under the label of us. Not emotionally at first, structurally. I revisited documents, accounts, and responsibilities I had managed informally for years. I clarified ownership, timelines, contingencies. Not because I expected disaster, because clarity is not pessimism. I noticed how much of our shared stability had rested on my quiet oversight. Bills paid on time, long-term planning, risk mitigation. These weren't dramatic contributions, so they had never been centered in the narrative of our relationship. They were simply assumed. I didn't remove myself from these systems. I made them visible. To myself, that distinction mattered. At the same time, I stopped anticipating Daniel's social needs. If he forgot a detail, I let him handle it. If he misjudged a tone, I didn't step in to reframe it. Not out of spite, but out of respect for both of us. He needed to experience his words without my translation. Friends began to notice subtle differences. Invitations came with fewer assumptions. Questions were directed more carefully. Some people became warmer, others are more distant. That told me everything I needed to know. Daniel became more self-conscious in public, not dramatically, but noticeably. He paused more, checked in less confidently. The ease he'd once relied on had shifted, not disappeared, just unbuffered. At home, he asked practical questions more often, about schedules, about plans I'd previously handled automatically. I answered clearly, but without stepping ahead of him. I wasn't withdrawing effort. I was withdrawing invisibility. This phase required restraint. It would have been easy to explain myself fully, to outline the years of small dismissals, the accumulation, the reasoning, but an explanation would have turned this into a debate. I wasn't debating my own experience. I was allowing consequences to emerge naturally. Silence protected the process. It prevented premature negotiation. It gave space for real observation, on his part and mine. I also paid attention to my own internal state. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't rehearsing outcomes. I felt prepared for adjustment, prepared for resistance, prepared for clarity, whatever form it took. That preparedness came from something simple. I was no longer relying on external validation to confirm my reality. The jokes had stopped landing, not because I asked them to stop, but because they no longer received reinforcement. And humor without reinforcement collapses quickly. This was the quiet phase, the one people overlook because nothing dramatic happens. But this is where outcomes are decided, because by the time consequences become visible, the path has already been chosen. I didn't rush this phase. I let it breathe. And as I moved in silence, others began to feel something they couldn't quite name. The loss of ease, the absence of cushioning, the difference between being supported and being carried. They just didn't know yet that what they were feeling was the beginning of accountability. Consequences rarely announce themselves with drama. They arrive as absences. At first, it was subtle, small misalignments that felt inconvenient rather than alarming. A dinner that felt slightly awkward. A story that didn't land the way it used to. A moment of silence that lingered just long enough to be noticed. People began to feel something was missing before they understood what it was. Daniel was the first to feel it consistently. Without my quiet buffering, his jokes sometimes reached the room without protection. Not disastrously, just plainly. When he leaned on the old humor, it didn't always get the response he expected. Laughter came later, softer, or not at all. He adjusted, then overcorrected. Spoke more carefully, then less naturally. Confidence, when unexamined, depends on familiar feedback, and the feedback had changed. At home, the ripple effects became clearer. Small things he had never had to think about suddenly required attention. Scheduling conflicts, financial details, long-term planning conversations he'd once skimmed now demanded engagement. Not because I refused to help, but because I stopped preempting. He wasn't used to the full weight of decisions. He'd always had my steadiness underfoot, quietly absorbing the complexity. Now that steadiness was still there, but it was no longer compensating. Friends, too, began to experience the shift. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt slightly off balance. The emotional shortcuts no longer worked. People who had relied on me to smooth tension found themselves sitting with it instead. Some adapted quickly. They became more thoughtful, more precise. They spoke to me instead of around me. Others pulled back. That response told me who had valued my presence and who had only valued my function. No one accused me of changing. No one confronted me directly. Instead, there was a vague sense of loss, a quiet confusion about why things didn't feel as effortless anymore. Effortlessness, I realized, had been expensive, and I had been paying the cost alone. Daniel began asking questions, not accusations, but confused check-ins. Did I say something wrong? You've been quiet lately. I answered honestly, but minimally. I'm fine. I'm just letting things play out. That phrase unsettled him more than any complaint would have, because letting things play out removes the illusion of control. He began to reflect, not deeply at first, but enough to feel uncomfortable. He replayed moments in his head, noticed reactions he'd previously overlooked, heard his own words without my reinterpretation. Awareness is rarely immediate. It creeps in. The consequences weren't punitive. They were proportional. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't punish him emotionally. I simply stopped absorbing impact that wasn't mine to carry. And without that absorption, the system had to recalibrate. Some friends began treating me with a new kind of respect. Not admiration, not fear, just attentiveness. They paused before speaking. They asked instead of assuming. That change wasn't loud, but it was real. Daniel, meanwhile, oscillated between defensiveness and self-awareness. He wanted reassurance that things were okay, but he also sensed that reassurance would no longer come automatically. He was beginning to understand the cost of casual dismissal, not as cruelty, but as erosion. And erosion doesn't show damage until something collapses. This phase wasn't satisfying, it wasn't vindicating, it was quiet, but it was necessary. Because the consequences that teach are rarely the ones that hurt the most. They're the ones that remove convenience. And convenience, once gone, leaves people alone with the truth of how much support they'd been taking for granted. The lesson had begun, not with shame, but with absence. By the time Daniel realized something was truly wrong, the window for easy repair had already closed. That's the thing about slow erosion. It doesn't feel urgent until the structure can no longer hold weight. At first, he tried small corrections. He softened his tone in public. He checked in more often. He made an effort to include me explicitly in conversations, sometimes awkwardly, as if following a rule he'd just learned. But these adjustments came too late to restore what had already shifted. Not because they were insincere, but because they were reactive. They were attempts to fix a feeling without understanding the cause. I could see the confusion in him, the way he replayed social moments trying to locate where things had gone off track. He wanted a clear error, a sentence he could apologize for, a moment he could undo. There wasn't one. That's what made it unbearable for him. You can't fix a pattern by addressing a single instance, and you can't rewind awareness once it arrives. He asked finally, one evening, carefully, as if stepping onto unstable ground, "Have I embarrassed you?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't defensive. It was genuine. I considered the question before answering, not because I needed time to craft a response, but because I wanted to be exact. "Yes," I said. "More or He flinched, not visibly, but internally. I could feel it. He asked when, how. Why hadn't I said anything sooner? I told him the truth. I didn't think you'd hear it while it was happening, and now I don't need to explain it. That was the moment he understood something had passed. Not trust, not affection, control over the narrative. He wanted to repair things the way people often do, through reassurance, promises, and emotional closeness. He wanted to talk it through, to reestablish comfort. But comfort wasn't what had been lost. Alignment was. And alignment can't be rushed back into place. He began to panic quietly. Not with anger or blame, but with urgency. He wanted to fix it before others noticed more than they already had, before the shift became permanent. But permanence doesn't wait for permission. I didn't reject him. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't dramatize the situation. I simply didn't rush to reassure him, because reassurance would have returned us to the old dynamic, the one where my emotional labor repaired damage I didn't cause. And I was done doing that. Friends noticed the distance now. Not conflict, distance. A subtle recalibration in how Daniel spoke, how I responded. They didn't know the details, but they felt the tension of something unresolved. That tension had nowhere to go. Daniel wanted to address it publicly, to show change, to demonstrate respect. But public repair without private understanding is performance. And I had no interest in performances anymore. I could see his regret forming. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, but real. He began to understand that the jokes weren't isolated, that they'd accumulated, that the room had learned to see me through his framing. That realization hurt him more than any argument would have. But understanding doesn't reverse time. The truth was simple and painful. If he had listened earlier, we might have adjusted quietly together. Now the adjustment had already happened, without him. He wasn't losing me. He was losing the version of me who managed everything for him. And that loss couldn't be negotiated away. Because what he wanted back wasn't just closeness. It was convenient. And once convenience is exposed for what it is, it can't be mistaken for love again. That was the moment repair became impossible. Not because I refused it, but because I no longer needed it in the form he was offering. What came next would require something deeper. Not an apology, transformation, and that couldn't be rushed. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There were no raised voices, no accusations stacked like evidence, no dramatic revelations. It happened on an ordinary evening, after dinner, when the house was quiet enough that nothing could hide behind the noise. Daniel sat across from me, hands folded, posture careful, not defensive, not relaxed either. He had reached the point where avoidance no longer worked and urgency had nowhere left to go. "I need to understand," he said, "because I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know when it started." I didn't rush to answer. That pause wasn't punishment, it was precision. "When it started," I said calmly, "isn't as important as when it became visible." He frowned slightly, trying to follow. "I didn't stop caring," I continued, "as I stopped compensating." That was the sentence that landed. I explained without heat, without listing every example, without revisiting old scenes. I spoke in patterns, not incidents. I told him how humor becomes framing, how repetition becomes identity, how silence, when mistaken for agreement, creates permission. He listened, really listened, not to defend himself, but to locate himself in the story. "I never meant to embarrass you," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That's why it went on as long as it did." That wasn't an attack, it was a fact. Intent hadn't protected me, and impact had accumulated, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. I told him I wasn't angry. That surprised him. Anger would have been easier to respond to. Anger invites repair rituals, apologies, reassurance, closeness. Clarity does not. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm just not stepping in anymore." He asked what that meant, for us. I was honest. "It means I won't correct narratives that diminish me. I won't soften jokes that land at my expense. I won't manage how others perceive you by managing myself." He absorbed that slowly. "So, if I mess up, then people will see it," I said, "including you." That frightened him. Not because he feared judgment, but because he feared exposure. The version of himself that had been buffered for years would now stand on its own. This confrontation wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. I told him I wasn't asking for perfection. I wasn't even asking for constant awareness. I was asking for ownership of words, of patterns, of public presence. And I was clear about something else. I'm not going back to who I was. That wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. We sat with that truth for a long time. Daniel nodded eventually. Not in agreement, yet, but in recognition. He understood that something fundamental had shifted, and that no amount of reassurance could undo it. This conversation didn't fix us. It clarified us. There's a difference. We didn't embrace afterward. We didn't cry. We cleaned up the kitchen together in quiet coordination, like two people learning a new rhythm. The confrontation without heat did what anger never could. It left no room for denial. And denial, once gone, forces a choice. Not for me, for him. Who I am now is not louder than who I was. That surprises people. They expect transformation to look like expansion. More words, stronger opinions, visible confidence. But my change didn't move outward. It moved inward, then settled. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't become distant. I didn't become cold. I became exact. I speak when I mean something. I stay silent when I don't. I no longer rush to make myself legible in rooms that benefit from misunderstanding me. And strangely, that has made it easier to understand. Daniel and I still share a life, but it is no longer organized around my quiet adaptability. He notices things now, pauses before joking, checks his framing, corrects himself without looking to me for cues. Not perfectly, but consciously. That matters more. Some friends adjusted with grace. They recalibrated how they spoke to me. They asked instead of assuming. Those relationships deepened, not because of conflict, but because of mutual clarity. Others drifted away. I let them. Distance isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's accuracy. What I no longer do is perform stability for the comfort of others. If a moment is awkward, I allow it to be awkward. If a comment lands poorly, I don't rescue it. That doesn't make me harsh. It makes me honest. I still listen, still care, still offer support when it's invited, not expected. The biggest change is this. I no longer confuse patience with permission. That distinction reshaped everything. I used to believe strength meant endurance, that if I could absorb discomfort without reacting, I was proving something: maturity, grace, love. Now I understand that endurance without boundaries is just self-erasure with good manners. I haven't hardened. I've clarified. There is no bitterness in me toward Daniel. There is realism. He is learning. Slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. Whether that learning is enough, time will tell. What I do know is that I will never again make myself smaller so that a room can remain comfortable. I don't need to be centered. I need to be accurate. I don't need to dominate. I need to be intact. People still describe me as calm. That hasn't changed. But now calm doesn't mean available. It means grounded. And grounded people don't disappear quietly. They remain, fully, without apology. There's a lesson in this story that took me a long time to understand, mostly because it hides behind politeness. Embarrassment, when repeated and disguised as humor, teaches lessons that pride never could. Not to the person being embarrassed, but to the people doing the watching. For years, I believed that staying calm meant staying above the situation, that if I didn't react, I was proving resilience. What I didn't see was how silence, when automatic, becomes consent. It trains people on how far they can go, how much can it take, how can one reduce someone without consequence. Pride would have demanded confrontation, a sharp correction, a public line in the sand. That might have felt satisfying in the moment, but it would have kept the focus on conflict instead of pattern. What changed everything was restraint. By stepping back instead of striking back, I allowed the dynamic to reveal itself fully. I let others feel the weight I had been carrying quietly. I didn't shame anyone. I didn't humiliate anyone. I simply stopped protecting them from themselves. That's a difficult thing to do, especially for people who are natural stabilizers, listeners, caretakers. We're taught that keeping things smooth is a virtue, that harmony is the goal. But harmony that depends on one person swallowing discomfort is not harmony. It's an imbalance. This story isn't about punishing a partner or winning a power struggle. It's about reclaiming authorship over your own presence, about understanding that dignity doesn't require loud defense. It requires clear boundaries and the courage to let consequences unfold naturally. If you see yourself in this, I want you to know something important. You don't have to explain your worth to people who benefit from misunderstanding you, and you don't have to announce your boundaries for them to be real. Sometimes, the most instructive thing you can do is nothing at all. Let the joke land without rescue. Let the silence stretch. Let people sit with the version of themselves they've been projecting. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because when you stop cushioning others, you start standing on solid ground. And solid ground doesn't shake when people finally notice it. Before we end, I'd like to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer in the comments, not just for me, but for each other. Have you ever realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting your peace, but protecting someone else's comfort at your expense? If so, what happened when you finally stopped?